Alright, so today I want to show you some ball pythons that are named after things that are sweet. And if you actually come up with a brand new ball python gene, maybe you're just breeding some snakes together, then you pop out something really crazy and you actually prove that that new gene is genetic and it's either recessive, dominant, or codominant, you can actually pretty much name that ball python morph whatever you want to name it. And it's kind of interesting. It almost seems like people were in their kitchen naming them after desserts or other sweet things around the kitchen when they came up with these names. So I'm going to jump over the internet and I want to show you some of these ball pythons that are named after things that are sweet. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to start with the candy ball python. If you actually have a sweet tooth, you may consider buying a candy. And the candy is actually a type of albino. As a matter of fact, it's actually compatible with the true albino. And if you look at the candy, the background color is almost like this, almost like a lavender purplish color, whereas in the true albino, it's like a really bright, stark white background. And if you actually breed the two together, you get a candino with one copy of the candy, one copy of the albino. And it's kind of interesting if you actually breed them together and produce a whole clutch of albinos and candinos. They all look exactly as an albino when they're hatchlings with a really bright background. And then as they age and mature, the candinos kind of transition into kind of halfway between the bright white and this lavender color. So sometimes if you're actually working with the candinos, you actually have to wait a few months for your hatchlings to mature a little bit before you can separate the candinos from the albinos. Kind of an interesting project. And there's another gene that is a lot of people consider exactly the same as the candy, and that is the toffee. Take a look at this. It's interesting. They have almost exactly the same gene. A lot of people consider them the same, and they're both named after things that are sweet, the toffee and the candy. And as a matter of fact, if you actually take a toffee and breed it to an albino, you get a toffino. And a lot of people actually separate the lines, the toffees and the candies. And sometimes you can actually come over to Morphmarket and you'll see snakes for sale that are listed as candies / toffees. And I think a lot of people think they originally started from two different lines and then they realized, hey, this is actually the same snake, and they kind of clumped them together. Some people, actually still really separate a lot of these lines. I think it really originates back to the original lineage of where these were actually discovered in two separate places by two separate people, and then they figure out it's the same thing, and then the lines kind of get blurred as people start producing more of them. So here's another one named after something sweet, and that is the chocolate. The chocolate is actually a dark ball python. It's a dark morph. You mix it with other genes and it kind of darkens the background. I'd say as far as a dark morph, it's not super dark like like the blackhead or the GHI. As a matter of fact, I've seen a lot of chocolates over here. People are listing them as possible chocolates because it's kind of a subtle morph, not really dominant unless you mix it with the right genes. Probably my favorite chocolate is the super chocolate. You breed two chocolates together, 25% of the time you get the super chocolate, and that is a really dark snake with a lot of reduced pattern too. Pretty awesome. So here is the vanilla. The vanilla is kind of an interesting morph, another sweet morph. It's actually, a lot of people consider it to be in the black-eyed leucistic. And when we're talking about black-eyed leucistics, we're talking about all white snakes with black eyes. And it's kind of interesting, even though they consider this to be in the black-eyed leucistic complex, it doesn't necessarily make a white snake with black eyes. As far as I know, you really can't produce a white snake. And you're probably scratching your head, why is it considered to be in the black-eyed leucistic? And that is because it is allelic or compatible with other genes in the black-eyed leucistic complex. And one of those is actually fire. So if you take a vanilla, mix it with fire, you get a vanilla cream. Talk about a wild looking snake. And this is actually really kind of an unexpected result when you're breeding these two together. You'd expect it to be an all-white snake. I'd say it's kind of like when you're mixing things into the blue-eyed leucistic with phantom then Mystic, and you get the purple passions and stuff like that. I'd say it's kind of similar to that, where it's compatible with the fire, but it doesn't make the white snake. And the vanilla cream, if you're wondering what jeans are in there, that is the vanilla and the fire. And you can actually add pastel to the mix, and this is what you get. You get a vanilla scream. Kind of an interesting combo. And looking at this snake, this is like such an amazing combination. And it's actually allelic, so if you actually bred this to something else, half the offspring would be vanilla, half the offspring would be fire, and then 50% of everything would be pastel, because this has pastel in the mix. Pretty awesome snake. So here's another one. This is the Caramel Albino. It's an albino with a little bit of caramel drizzled on the top. As a matter of fact, this is it's considered to be an albino, but it's not compatible with the Toffees or the candies or the true albino, just the regular albino gene. It's kind of in a whole separate class by itself. And it's kind of interesting. This is one of the few albinos where it doesn't have the really bright red eyes. A lot of these caramel albinos kind of have this darker eye, and I'm actually trying to produce my first caramel albinos this year. It's a really awesome morph. So here is the honey. The honey is actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, and as a matter of fact, if you actually take honey and you mix it with like Mystic and Phantom and a lot of the other genes, like if you mix them with Mojave, you get like the purple passions and all the kind of the purple snakes. If you actually, I was kind of looking through all the different honeys, and it looks like when you're mixing honey with anything in the blue-eyed leucistic, you get all white snakes with bright blue eyes, which is kind of interesting that it's kind of compatible with everything to make the really bright white snakes. So here is the Mocha. The Mocha is also in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, and when it comes to the kind of the ultimate blue eyes in the blue-eyed leucistic, if you're looking for the brightest blue eyes of any snakes, you can mix in Mocha with other genes in the blue-eyed leucistic, and you can actually get some of the brightest blue eyes that I've ever seen on a really bright white snake. So Mocha is pretty awesome. Another sweet gene, the Mocha. Here is the butter. The butter is actually in the fridge on the door on the right in your refrigerator. It's kind of interesting. Someone's going through the kitchen. Hey, let's name it honey and vanilla and butter. It's kind of unusual to actually be in the kitchen and you have all your snake morphs all around you in the kitchen. The butter is essentially the same thing as the lesser. A lot of people really separate these lines. Some people consider them to be the same exact gene, but you never really see anyone listing a snake as a butter slash lesser, even though a lot of people consider them to be the same exact gene. These are also in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. You breed two butters together, and 25% of the time you get an all-white snake with blue eyes. Pretty awesome. So here is the cinnamon. The cinnamon is kind of an interesting morph. It's actually a pretty dark morph, makes for some really dark snakes. If you breed two cinnamons together, you get almost a completely black snake, almost like a brownish black that is completely patternless. As a matter of fact, the cinnamon is actually compatible with black pastel. So if you breed a cinnamon and black pastel together, you get an 8-ball, which is a really dark snake that is completely patternless. Pretty awesome. And the cinnamon is I'd say it's probably one of the darker morphs as far as dark morphs. Some of the morphs in the dark side of things, if you actually start mixing in certain things like the chocolate, I'd say, you know, if you're comparing the cinnamon to the chocolate, I would say the cinnamon is a little bit darker, quite a bit darker than the chocolate. So here is the sugar, right out of the sugar bowl. And the sugar is actually considered to be pretty much the same thing as calico. And sugar, essentially what it does is it brings up a lot of white on the sides of the snake. And you really don't want to confuse this with the spider gene. A lot of times in the spider, it actually has a lot of white coming up. It almost looks like it has sugar or calico in the mix in the spider, and that is just part of the spider gene. And the sugar is really awesome, and it's kind of variable too. You can actually get really low white on a lot of snakes, and some snakes, just mixing in just the sugar with other genes, sometimes you can really get a lot of white coming up the side to where you just have a little bit of color right down the top of the snake and the sides are really white. It's extremely variable. As a matter of fact, a lot of people say this is possibly sugar or sugar slash calico because it's such a low white side. Sometimes you can almost hardly tell that sugar is in the mix. Here is the banana. The banana is kind of another sweet morph, and the banana is actually a codominant morph. You breed it to something else, half the offspring come out as banana. And banana, at first, they thought it was another version of albino. Come to find out it's actually codominant instead of recessive. And bananas can kind of tricky. As a matter of fact, if you look at the snake, it looks so impressive as a hatchling. I actually hatched out some coral glows, which a lot of people think the coral glow and the banana is the same thing. And when they're really young, like hatchlings like this, they have all these oranges and purples and look really impressive. And as they grow, they completely transform into completely different colors. They lose a lot of the oranges, pretty much all the oranges and all the purples, and they turn into more of a two-tone yellow. And if you actually look really close on this one, it looks like it has little speckles, little black spots on the snake. And as they grow and mature, those black spots actually increase, and you get a two-tone yellow snake with all these freckles over it. Looks completely different than a banana when it's a hatchling. Here's another one, the Dreamsicle. And the Dreamsicle, I was thinking, you know, this kind of sounds like something you'd pull out of your freezer, like some kind of popsicle or something like that. The Dreamsicle is actually a lavender albino pied. So it's kind of tricky to hit because it's actually a double recessive, the lavender albino. And then the pied is responsible for the large splotches of white. And I'd say this is probably one of the pied combos that have held their price over the long term, probably strongest out of any more that I've ever seen. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at this one's selling for $2,250, still for sale, and it's a male. Pretty awesome project to get into. Here is the Pastel Calico, and this is kind of interesting. I was actually coming over here on Morphmarket, and I typed in bubblegum, and bubblegum, it actually came up as 2 genes. As a matter of fact, if you come over here on Morphmarket and you type in like vanilla scream and do a search, it'll actually break it up into all the individual genes. I came over here, typed in bubblegum, and to my surprise, it actually broke it up into pastel and calico. And the funny thing about bubblegum is that I always thought bubblegum was another name for calico, not necessarily the combination of pastel and calico. As a matter of fact, I want to bring you over here. This is actually the genetic wizard over here on the World of Ball Pythons. I typed in calico and I crossed it with the pastel. You can kind of see your breeding results if you're kind of wondering what your results would be if you bred 2 snakes together. You hit calculate and you can see over here the results on the bottom all the way down here. Quarter of the offspring will be normal wild type ball pythons, 25% will be calico, and it also lists the calico as a bubblegum, also known as a sugar, which is kind of interesting that they actually listed it as bubblegum and sugar. And this one actually, if you actually look at the very bottom results, 25% of the time you'll get a calico pastel, which is also known as a bubblegum pastel. So it's kind of interesting. Over on Morphmarket, the bubblegum is actually broken up into 2 genes, the bubblegum pastel, but over here I'm pretty sure most people consider the bubblegum to be the same as the calico, which is also the same as the sugar. So here's another interesting combo. This is actually a fire and a chocolate together. This is also known as the hot chocolate. It's kind of interesting. I was looking at all the fire chocolates over here, and nobody actually listed their fire chocolate as the hot chocolate. And you can actually go over to Morphmarket, type in hot chocolate, and do a search, and it'll actually split up the genes into fire and chocolate. And I want to give you just a couple more really advanced snakes. This is a little bit more advanced. This is actually the cinnamon Oreo Blizzard. Take a look at this snake, and it's kind of interesting. The Oreo and the Oreo Blizzard is considered to be the pastel, the yellow belly, and the calico, those 3 genes together. And this also has cinnamon in the mix. So this is the cinnamon Oreo Blizzard. Makes you hungry for some ice cream. And I actually went one step further. Take a look at this. This is actually the chocolate peanut butter Oreo Blizzard, which is pretty incredible. And this is a wild looking snake. Look at all the different things. They're actually calling this a paradox, which kind of has kind of unreproducible, kind of the dark splotches all through the snake. And I found most of these Oreo Blizzards kind of have some interesting splotches here and there that you really can't reproduce. And the ringer is kind of interesting too. As a matter of fact, if you come over here and look at some of the genes in the chocolate peanut butter Oreo Blizzard, essentially what it is you actually have the Calico, the Pastel, and the Yellow Belly that makes up the Oreo Blizzard. Gives kind of almost like a patternless speckled snake, which is kind of interesting. And then on top of that, they're actually adding the black pastel and the butter that they're calling the chocolate peanut butter, which is kind of an interesting combo. And then the ringer, a lot of times the ringers are actually associated with certain genes. Some people say the ringers are actually associated with the het pied, so sometimes you can get het pied in the mix. But I'd say if you actually start adding a lot of genes on top of each other, like in this case, you probably get a lot of ringers. Alright, so it is time for the question of the day. And Harry McBride asks, can you help me figure out what kind of ball python I have? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, I think that's the #1 question that a lot of people ask in the comment section under my videos. They're like, hey, I have this ball python, I bought it, and I don't know what genes are in it. Can you help me figure out what genes are in the snake? And I'd say that's probably one of the most difficult things, especially if you don't know where that snake came from the original breeding. As a matter of fact, if you're actually breeding ball pythons and you know the genes in both parents, sometimes it's actually a challenge to figure out which genes that the offspring actually inherited and how they mix together. When I first started out in ball pythons, I was always posting all my hatchlings over on the reptile forum saying, hey, I don't know, I can't tell the difference between a bamboo and a pastel bamboo. And sometimes there are really slight differences that really take some experience to figure out and know. And as a matter of fact, if you actually have an unknown, probably the best place to actually figure out what it is, you can actually upload a video or a picture somewhere on the internet and then post a link down in the comments section under any video, and I'll definitely see it and I'll give it a shot. I'll try to figure out exactly what's in it, and it's not 100%. As a matter of fact, if you think you know what's in there, I've actually had recently someone showed me a ball python that looks like it might have some yellow belly in it, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm not really good on my yellow belly identification. So if you actually had something like that, you could actually breed it back to something like an ivory, which is a super yellow belly. And if you actually produced 50% ivories, all white snakes, then you'd know for sure there is actually yellow belly in the mix. And you can actually have like asphalt or gravel or yellow belly, and a lot of those look really similar. Unless you actually prove them out, it's really difficult to know exactly what you have. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.